Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, sorry, it's all working. My theme this year has been working together, and I would like to reflect on, over the next few minutes, and celebrate some of the great things we have done together. This is not going to be a long list of the many, many things accomplished this year, just a couple of highlights of the things that I'm proud of or that are personal to me. Firstly, I've got to say, I am astonished at the unbelievable number of reports, guides, technical publications and the like that have been produced. Roads to Revolution, and I'll wave my copy. Yeah. It's been a long time in the preparation, but it's been well worth the wait. It's the third in the series, all of which have been well received, and thanks to our sponsors, FM Global, Marsh, Zurich, KPMG, and Russell Group. And particular thanks to Julia Graham. I know there's been an awful lot of midnight oil burnt in getting this sorted out, so thank you very much. Reputation is key for all of us. Hard won and lost in an instant. Roads to Ruin looked at the high-profile crises of companies which left their reputations in tatters. Roads to Resilience looked at how companies could be helped to avoid corporate catastrophe. And now Roads to Revolution provides pragmatic advice for risk professionals and board members. It's aimed at those who want to ensure that risk management, resilience, and digital transformation permeate their organization constantly to protect brand and reputation. The other document I'm going to point to, is the D&O Guide. A really excellent example of something that's not always given the highest profile attention, except by board members. And as we all know, they don't necessarily understand the cover that well. And it's this sort of material which explains things in an accessible way, really useful. Now, the other thing I'm personally proud of is the annual dinner at the Grosvenor. It was a really enjoyable evening, and a record amount of over £17,000 was raised for Insurance United Against Dementia, supporting the work of the Alzheimer's Society. Thanks to all of you who may have attended and gave so generously. Now, the ERM Forum in November was a sellout again. It's rapidly becoming a key event in the risk management diary, and the day is most definitely set for later this year. Fast Track Forum was again a great success this year, despite the blizzard conditions in March, and it will be back again next year. And of course, the many, many academies and roundtables that carry on. But the thing I'm most pleased to see is the students on the CAS Leadership Programme. These participants are leading the way that the profession needs to develop. John said on Monday, what works well now may be obsolete in a few years' time, so we need people skilled not just in technical matters, but leadership skills. The first cohort will complete their studies this autumn, and we're already working on the next intake. On the members front, there's been steady growth, mainly in the 400 or so organizations with four or more members. That suggests a broadening of the membership into areas, or non-traditional areas, outside of insurance. We have a rich vein of material that members can mine, and with the network that AIRMIC creates, it shouldn't take too many clicks or calls to find out what you need from a trusted source. I feel it's necessary to make a quick comment about diversity. There has been criticism of our panel debates in the past, and there may be again for this year. I have to confess, I was sitting on the panel last year as one of the 4 or 5, white middle-aged men. I can assure you it's not for want of trying by the organising committee. We seek diverse representation of speakers at our events, but have not quite cracked it yet. Having said that, I was in a meeting, a Brexit meeting this morning, where we managed a gender-balanced panel. And on another positive note, our board is pretty much 50-50 balanced, reflecting the membership, I think, and looking around, probably the conference delegates as well. It shows we're making progress, so watch this space. I just have to make a few comments about the conference. It's a bit like the Olympics. You can stand up here and say, it's the latest one, it's the best one, but it really feels like that. The numbers are just amazing. 480 members, 1,800 people coming through. And I think about 60 different events. And there has been a real buzz around the event. And the quality of the workshops, which I think is what keeps people coming back, it's absolutely first class. So, it's a great conference. The Hub was an innovation this year. It was a bit of an experiment. I think it'll be back next year. If you didn't give it a go this year, please try it next. The panel debates were excellent. I think the session with Spencer was one of the best panels I've listened to. I've made lots of notes during that session, and the scary one that jumps out at me when I was looking back through was about some of the sort of ethical questions that are going to be posed by AI. The insurance panel produced some interesting debate on what Hugh Edwards described as a challenging news day. For me, an insurer recognizing that the top risks for business may not necessarily be addressed by insurance is a recognition that to stay relevant, new solutions are needed. Now, this isn't news to members, but it is an admission that things need to evolve if insurance is to remain strategically important. Another highlight for me is the run during the conference. It's brilliant to see so many people turn out and do something healthy after partying on a Monday night, so well done to all of you who did that. And on behalf of everyone, I would like to thank the events committee, John, and all of the AMIC team for the hard work that has gone into to the event. So the other thing I have to do to wrap up on the conference is the stand awards. So, winner of small stand this year goes to Crawford & Co. Come on. There you are.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And if you can tip it forward again, otherwise I get a reflection. That's good.
Thank you.
We'll all bring our sunglasses next year in case you do the same sort of thing again. Thank you. Well done. And the winner of the large stand goes to Travellers again. So there's a bit of a sort of, bar has been raised. So there's a cry for action there. Now to a few final words. As I wind up my duties as chairman, I really must express my personal thanks to John Ludlow and the AMIC team for all their hard work this year, to the board and all of the committee members who give their time freely and with passion, to our partners and sponsors for both their financial and intellectual support, and all of the exhibitors, and especially to all of the members for attending. So now it's my great pleasure to welcome Linda Lucas, who will share a few thoughts on her plans for the next 12 months. Linda.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Paul. I'm honoured and privileged to serve as our chairman for the coming year. And I just want to say that stepping into this role is made so much easier by the actions and the groundwork laid by Paul and our predecessors. I've also count myself lucky, Paul, to have been able to work with you closely over the last 2 years. So, the handover from John to John, and that meant Paul and I perhaps worked closer together than deputy chairman together often do. As many of you are aware, I'm a company secretary by profession. I fell into risk and insurance by accident because those functions have often sat within my company secretarial responsibilities. Over the years, I came to realise that I preferred risk and insurance to the compliance focus of company secretarial work. And I'm sure all of you would agree, but let's not tell the ICSA that that's what I said. AMIC has a special place in my heart because each time I return to risk and insurance after a company secretarial gap, it's the place I turn to find out what has changed and to benchmark best practice. This enables me to step straight back into a role, and it has definitely contributed to my personal success. So I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to help ensure that AIRMIC continues to provide that sort of support for part-time risk and insurance managers like myself, as well as for people who are new to risk and insurance, and those expert members who contribute so much to our organisation and to our collective knowledge. I'm really looking forward to this year, and amongst the highlights that I'm anticipating, we're going to be doing the deep dive member survey, and there will be associated mini reports which will help AIRMIC and its partners understand what really matters to our members and also what keeps them awake at night. I think there's going to be a continuing shift in the balance of focus towards risk management. The ERM conference is increasing in importance, and as Paul mentioned, this year that's going to take place on the 6th of November. There are going to be a series of technology papers launched at the Technology Academy Day, and I think that's scheduled for September. And while I'm thinking about it, don't forget the FIRMA seminar, which is going to be in Antwerp on the 6th to 8th of October. A key feature of AIRMIC is our diversity. Our membership comes from, we have academic institutions, we have not-for-profit organisations, we have public sector bodies, we have SMEs, individuals, as well as large corporates. Members come from a wide range of industry sectors and from a wide range of disciplines. Not everyone has risk or insurance in their job title. You know, as I mentioned, I'm a company secretary. And Paul spoke about the board, so we have a roughly 50-50 male-female mix, but diversity means so much more than that. Each one of us has different challenges and perspectives. Each of us has something to contribute. So I really encourage all of you to participate everywhere you can. I think AIRMIC's output will be more robust if it derives from the contributions of a wide spectrum of our membership. We're in a period of change, there's no doubt about that. So technological change is accelerating. We've got AI and the Internet of Things, we've got robotics and blockchain, VR, not to mention AVR, and these things are impacting our daily lives already. Geopolitical change springs surprises when you least expect them. Economic and environmental change are just facts of life, and all of this is leading to societal change. And you notice I said all of that without even mentioning the 29th of March 2019. All of this change isn't going to stop. So we need to embrace it and find the opportunities in it. For members, this means developing resilience, not just for your organisations, but for yourselves. Take advantage of the professional development offered by AIRMIC to advance your personal skill set and reinvent yourself. Use the technical output to increase the resilience of your organisations. For our partners and stakeholders, this means using your extraordinary insight and experience to ensure that your service offerings anticipate as well as reflect change so that they stay relevant. So in summary, AIRMIC is going to build on the strengths of the technical programme and the learning and development programme. Deliver robust output by engaging its diverse membership and help members to find the opportunities in change. About 55 years ago, in fact 55 years ago, in June 1963, John Kennedy said, change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past or present are certain to miss the future. So, armed with the tools, all of you in this room are equipped, educated, and have the experience to be the least daunted by change and uncertainty. So, armed with those tools and the mindset to maximize the opportunities that present themselves, I encourage all of you to embrace change and let's find the opportunities in all the changes that we're going to meet in the year ahead. Now, I guess you're expecting Frank Gardner to be coming up next, but as I mentioned, geopolitical change springs surprises, and Frank was surprised to find that he was travelling to somewhere in the Middle East today, now, so we don't have him. But we do have our next session on, I'm going to say it's on heightened geopolitical tension, but hopefully that's about right. And we've got Jeremy Bowen here, a seasoned war correspondent and journalist with a vast knowledge and experience of the Middle East. And I expect he can explain why the surprises that I mentioned aren't surprising at all in geopolitical change. Jeremy has reported from over 70 countries. He's come under fire multiple times. And he's won so many awards that I actually don't have time to list them today. Since 2005, he's been the BBC Middle East editor, and his role, I think, enables him to cast light on some of the most complex areas of the world. So, Jeremy, welcome to AIRMIC. Now, while Jeremy's making his way here, remember you can ask questions, and you need to use the Slido app to do that, so they appear up here for Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you. Well, good day, everybody. It's good afternoon already. Came as a bit of a surprise to me as well to find myself in Liverpool today. Frank has actually pinched my cameraman and producer this week, so I felt that I might as well get something out of the fact that I can't work now because he's gone off with my staff. But, you know, he's a good lad, and I will try and do my best to fill that Frank-shaped space that was left here by his mission to Socotra. He's gone to Socotra, which is a really, he'll be reporting on it, but it's an island in the Gulf of Aden off Yemen, which has got some absolutely unique features, and he will be talking about it on air, I imagine, in the course of the next week or two. I'm glad to see questions already coming in, but I'm going to get going and talk a bit, and then I will pick up these as we go, and also a bit later on. Interesting to hear you guys talking about risk and risk management, because that's something that at the BBC and in the world of foreign news reporting, which I inhabit, has changed a great deal in the time I've been doing it. I've been with the BBC for more than 30 years. And when I first went to a war zone, which was El Salvador in 1989, the attitude towards risk management, risk assessment that we had then is so different to how it is now. I mean, I know that is partly to do with laws, but it's also to do with, I think it's just a different mindset, and probably thankfully. I'll tell you how it happened in 1989, and it was my first war. I was working in our office in Washington, D.C., and some of you will remember the legendary BBC correspondent, Martin Bell, the man who used to wear a white suit famously, and he was very superstitious. He always had a pair of green socks. In his pocket, he had a silver dollar. his producer always knew what to buy him for Christmas, green socks. And that was probably, you know, green socks and a silver dollar in your pocket was about the closest we got to risk management back then. He said to me, you know, there'd been this big flare-up in El Salvador in Central America, a long-running civil war. And Martin said to me, do you fancy going down? And I had never been in a war. And he'd been to loads. He'd been in Vietnam, God knows what else. And of course, I said yes. I was a young, ambitious reporter. I was about 28, 29 years old. And I thought, God, why is he letting me? Why is he letting me? Because, you know, my producer had told me that Martin always liked doing El Salvador because he, you know, is a bit of an old romantic. And he had a romantic interest in El Salvador. And it seemed to have gone a bit critical because the person concerned, the woman concerned, was apparently putting a photo of him on her bedside table, which was fine for her, but her husband was very angry about it. That's probably a complete lie, by the way. But it was told to me in good faith, 1989. It wasn't fake news back then, maybe now, who knows. So anyway, I didn't know what to pack. I took my trainers because I figured I'd be running quite a bit in one direction or another. And I mean, now when we travel to places, we have really very elaborate first aid kits. And, you know, and also we get sent on quite extensive first aid training, part of hostile environments courses. You know, if there was, one of you suddenly had a traumatic amputation, a sucking chest wound, I could help you out, you know, with or without my first aid kit, frankly. Back then, I didn't even have a Band-Aid, and I probably wouldn't have known quite what to do with a Band-Aid either. So we went down there. On day one, I went out in the back of a pickup with a Salvadorian cameraman, driving towards where the noise and the smoke and the sounds were. And I had never heard a bullet fired in anger. I'd never seen a dead body. I'd never found myself lying in the gutter with that sort of mad insect noise of bullets when they're fired over your head. They go pish, 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 like that. And in fact, there are many people who say that journalists should be in the gutter most of the time because that's where we feel most comfortable and deserve to be. But, you know, it is so different now. Because then I went back to the hotel and we did our piece, and there was a curfew. You couldn't go out at night, so we sat in the hotel. We had dinner on the terrace. The weather was lovely. There's a extinct volcano in the center of San Salvador covered in jungly vegetation, and you could see the green and red tracer flying back and forth as they continued their fighting through the night. And I thought it was incredible. I thought I was in my own war movie. Now, that obviously was a little bit of an asinine point of view, but I was young and I'd been drinking deeply from this cup of adrenaline. And for people who are in my line of work, that's still an important thing, I think, very much, is that you need a bit of adrenaline to get yourself through it. As the time went by, and I've been to more than 20 wars now, I've realized that what it's all about is actually a high journalistic purpose. It's, you know, shining a light into some of the dark corners of the world and trying to explain what's going on. And I'm going to try and explain a little bit today about the Middle East. I mean, now, though, in terms of just on this subject of managing risk, I mean, we have a whole department called High Risk. We didn't have that back then. We have these courses, as I say. And when you do your first course, they make sure they kidnap you, they knock you about a bit. Since I've been knocked about for real in the course of my work, so I say to them now when I go on the refresher courses, I just want you guys to know, if you knock me about, I'm going to take my ball and I'm going to go home with it, because I'm not, you know, this is just a little game we're playing here. I don't need, you know, some ex-squaddy to whack me into the side of the car, as happened once, when he got a bit too carried away with his role as a drunken Serb militiaman at a checkpoint. He had actually been getting really into character, drinking. So you know, so we do that every 3 years or so. I would say that as far as insurance is concerned, I'm a thoroughly bad risk. I'm a thoroughly bad risk because I've been I've been locked. In the course of my working life, I've been locked up, gassed, knocked about, robbed, traveled on any number of dodgy airplanes, been in a few near plane crashes, helicopter crashes, and I've been shot. So all told, I don't know who does pay my premium, but it's not me. There's some good questions here, but I'll make a bit of progress, as the politicians say, and then I'll try and answer some of them. You know, the thing about what's going on, hang on a minute. The thing about what's going on at the moment in the Middle East is that while it appears at times to be something like random violence, it's not random. There is a lot of violence in the region, but it's not necessarily events that would come as a surprise if you can try and work out the patterns that lie. Oh, what's the glass here? The patterns that lie behind it. Hang on. You know, to start with, I mean, I'll talk a little bit about the wider world, but if I can concentrate on the Middle East to start with, it's a very big area, excuse me, to fly from North Africa, from somewhere like Algiers or Tripoli, down to the Gulf, down to, say, Dubai. If you can do it in one hop, will be 6 or 7 hours. I mean, that's pretty much almost the same as flying across the Atlantic. I mean, you're talking about a large area. But there are, because of shared language and culture, there are a lot of connections. And the first thing to know about the Middle East is that everything is connected. There are loads of different connections, some strong, some weak, and some things are really hardwired, and some things are a bit more tenuous. Now, one of the reasons why the war in Syria has been so disastrous is that Syria is connected. It's right bang in its own area of the Middle East, and it is connected to loads of other places through religion, through history, through family connections, through tribes, through politics. And so when Syria imploded, the vibrations went over a large area, and they still do. And we've got a question about Syria, actually, which I'll pick up now. What do you think the outcome will be in Syria? Well, at the moment, what's happened is that the war, which was President Assad and his people against those who wanted to overthrow him, Assad has pretty much won it with the help of the Russians, the Iranians, various friendly militias, Hezbollah from Lebanon, various Iraqi militias as well. But there's another war which is going on, which is involving big powers, and which I think of as a mini world war. The Turks are involved, the Russians are involved, the Americans are involved, the British have got special forces there, the French have, Iran, of course, and they all have their own different agendas there. And so, in a sense, that's not even about the Syrians, that particular war. So, answer to that question, the war is going to continue, and it's not going to be an easy end. And in the end, it's going to have to be big powers, I think, that will do it. Now, I think another important pattern to recognize in the region is that there's a basic split in it. And if you think about these first of all, connections, and then who's with who, then if you look at that, you get a better idea of just exactly how the whole thing breaks down and where the trouble may be. And one really basic split there is Friends of Iran, which means Syria, Syrian government, Hezbollah in Lebanon, quite a few politicians in Iraq, various Iraqi militias, those friends, Houthis in Yemen, against Friends of America. And Friends of America, for these purposes, include Israel, they include Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the other Sunni Muslim monarchies, like Jordan, for example. And that is a really fundamental split, and it's one of the things which is driving conflict at the moment. And not where Frank is, but where I'm trying to look in to get to, it'll probably be very difficult in the next week or couple of weeks, is there's a long-running war now. It's been going since 2015 in Yemen. Yemen right at the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula. And when that started, the official view on it, the official word that was given out by the Saudis who led the coalition that went to war there, was that they were going to war in Yemen to restore the legitimate government. In fact, that wasn't the case. They went to war in Yemen because it's this split. If you think about this split, they went to war in Yemen because they saw the hand of the Iranians at work in Yemen. And I went to have, when it all started, I went to have, to see the Saudi ambassador in London, who's called Prince Mohammed. And we sat down in the Dorchester to have a cup of tea. And I said, come on, what's this really about? And he said, this is about Iran. He said, yeah, we're saying it's about restoring the official government. It's not, it's about Iran. It's about Iran because they are messing around in our backyard. We, Saudi Arabia, have Yemen as our backyard, and these guys are messing around in our backyard. They're pushing us, and we are not going to stand for it anymore. And more recently, I spoke to a very senior Saudi official, very, very senior, and he was speaking in such an inflammatory tone about the Iranians. I said to him, you sound like a guy who's representing a country who's preparing to go to war against Yemen. He said, yeah, against Iran. He said, yeah, maybe we are. We'd do it. These people have been pushing us around. They've been killing our diplomats. No one answers them. No one pushes back. Now we are going to push back. And they've been trying to do that since 2015. So what's happened this morning is that Yemen has one main port that functions. And it's important because all the relief aid for a country, 80% of the people there live off external aid, food aid, and so on. And this port, Hodeidah, on the Red Sea, is controlled by I mean, it's a bit complex in Yemen, but I'll try not to get too detailed. There's this group called the Houthis, who are supported by Iran to a degree. And they are in control of Hodeidah. Now, the Saudis and the people from the United Arab Emirates have attacked it today. It started this morning. And the UN has been warning them not to do it. They worry that their peace plan is going to be destroyed. They worry that 250,000 lives could be at stake in terms of people in need there who would suffer if they lost their food supplies. So it's a really big deal, and you'll hear more about it on the news, I think. But it's about Iran as far as the Saudis and the Emiratis are concerned, because it's this split, this really important split to think about. And the Americans have very much jumped on all of that as well, because under the Trump administration, they are very, very suspicious of Iran. Those of you who follow these things might have seen on the news that they've pulled out of the nuclear deal that was made to try to stop Iran getting a nuclear weapon. It wasn't a great deal, but it was the only deal they had, and there's no plan B. Trump feels there is a plan B, which is very strong pressure through sanctions, and then they'll come to the table, the Iranians, and they will give much more. We'll see. I kind of doubt it, to be honest. So he has very much gone on the coattails then of the Iranians and also the Israelis. So if you think of that triangular axis, the Americans, the Israelis, the Saudis, brackets, and their friends like the Emiratis, they are pushing now very hard against Iran. Question, will Iran just stand for all that? Or Will Iran try to push back? They've already sent some missiles into Israel, not very successfully, and Israel is way more powerful than they are militarily. But Iran is not to be dismissed. It's 80 million people. It's got a lot of politics going on there. There are people who believe that they can do a deal with the West. They're losing out at the moment. And people there who believe they can't possibly do a deal with the West, and they're on the ascendancy at the moment. So there's a lot they can do around the region to make trouble. So that's something to look at. That is a decided risk that this tension between friends of Iran and friends of America in the Middle East is going to lead to more violence. It's entirely possible. It's leading to more violence today in a way that's really quite serious with this, this attack on Hodeidah. Right then, let's just pick up a couple of questions that have come up here. We're involved with support of our colleagues traveling to challenging locations. What advice would you offer about personal safety and risk assessment? Well, the only really safe way of avoiding danger in a challenging location is not to go, to be honest. I think that I would say to people, you know, the only really easy way of covering a war without putting yourself in harm's way is not to go. Just do it from home. If you do go, though, I think there are many ways of minimizing risk. First of all, you've got to be very aware of the risks you face. And even though they can be very boring to fill out, risk assessment's quite good because they make you think about what you might face. Of course, the kind of places which I go to, my poor producer has to do all this stuff. And you know, risks, you know, what are the risks of where you go? Kidnap, death, serious disease, dangerous road traffic accidents, you name it. I mean, in places like some parts of the Middle East. But I think that if you're aware of the dangers in a place where you go and you think about them in advance, and more than anything else, the important thing is to minimize your exposure. In the TV business, we used to have to minimize our exposure because the way that we got our pictures back was by sending them from a portable satellite ground station. And when I say portable, it was only portable if you had a small lorry. It wasn't exact. Now you can put something in a backpack. I mean, literally a laptop and a few cables, and that will more or less do it. But back then, I mean, the first time I went to Afghanistan in '88, I think it was, we sent pictures from there. We carried with us 1,000 kilos of equipment, a ton of equipment. About 2 miles of cabling as well to re-cable the TV station so we could feed from it. I mean, now all of that resides in a Mac that my cameraman carries. So that kind of thing has changed no end. But what it's meant for us in terms of risk is that sometimes it is more tempting to stay in a dangerous place as long as you've got some kind of internet signal, because you can. And it used to be that you'd have to race back. You'd have, say, an hour or two in the middle of the day where you could gather some material, and then you'd drive back about 2 hours to where the Earth station was, generally in some commodious hotel, where you could have a shower, have a nice dinner, put your piece together, have a good night's sleep in a bed, and be much more comfortable. Now, we can stay in places longer, and that is more dangerous because you increase your exposure. So for me, I would say cardinal rules: be aware of what the risks are, and spend as little time as possible exposed to them. Because the longer you're exposed to risks, the more danger you're going to be in. Actually, I was going to get on to the Israelis, so this is a good question. What is the key impact of the US opening its embassy in Jerusalem? And should they reverse the decision? Well, I don't think they are going to reverse the decision under President Trump. That's the first thing. I was in Jerusalem on the day that they opened their new embassy there. I even have a baseball cap, which they gave to the official guests, not to the villains of the press, but I thought it was quite nice, so I managed to get hold of one. Baseball cap saying U.S. Embassy, Jerusalem, Israel. Now, in terms of, moving it was an issue because the status quo there is supposed to be only changed through negotiation and through agreement. But the Americans, Trump said, look, deal with realities. Israel's in control of Jerusalem, therefore we're going to put our embassy there. Plus for his base, his political base, it was an important promise to keep. So I went there. I mean, it was the most bizarre thing. Because on that day, there were big demonstrations in Gaza, and the Israelis killed 60 demonstrators who they say were activists for Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, and the people in Gaza said were mainly demonstrators. No Israeli soldiers were harmed in that. They said that they had to use live fire because they were in danger, but not one Israeli soldier was wounded. Yet I was in Jerusalem. I went to Gaza the next day, but I was in Jerusalem, and I went to this embassy opening, and Netanyahu spoke there, and Ivanka Trump and her husband Jared Kushner were there, and most of the guests were Republicans from various Jewish Republican and pro-Israel movements in the US who'd come over specially. I think they were big donors. I think to get a seat there, you had to be a big donor. And it was like living in a different universe to the universe that the Palestinians inhabited in Gaza. So you had Netanyahu, the prime minister, making a speech saying, this is good for peace. And Trump as well, coming in by video link, saying, this is good for peace. But as President Macron of France said recently, apparently to Trump, how could it be good for peace, the movement of the embassy, if people are dying? In up to 60 people killed that day, and others subsequently. How is that good for peace? So it was a real split-screen moment, and a lot of TV channels had this. They had people congratulating. There was a sense of, at the embassy, a sense of victory, a sense of mutual congratulation and back-slapping. And then on the other side of the screen, there was the Israeli army opening fire on demonstrators and killing a lot of them. So it was a sign of the immense gap between the way people think, the two sides of the argument. And so, how does this fit into what I was saying? Well, friends of Israel, friends of Iran, friends of America and friends of Iran. Mr. Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, is obsessed by Iran and the potential threats it presents to Israel. He's obsessed by it. When Ahmadinejad was the president of Iran, he'd said repeatedly, it's 1938 and Ahmadinejad is Hitler. Well, he still would probably say that, but actually Iran did not attack Israel in that period, and they didn't try and inflict a second Holocaust on the Jewish people, and so I think his assessment was wrong. But at the moment, because of the support he's had from Trump, Mr. Netanyahu he feels he can do anything. You can see it when he was over here last week. He feels that he is on the side of history, that finally all the numbers on the fruit machine have come together for him and for Israel and for his agenda, which is that Iran is bad and maybe we're going to have to bomb Iran. So he's not really bothered about the Palestinian issue closer to home. He should be, I think, because I think it's blowing up again. You've seen it with the tensions in Gaza. Until the political reality changes, they will always have recurring, serious outbreaks of violence there. serious outbreaks of violence, and particularly around Gaza, where they've had a number of wars in the last few years. I think they're building up to another one. It could easily have gone that way when those 60 people were killed. Should we care about that? It's a long way from home, after all. Yeah, I think we should, because apart from the fact that people will die, I think that that level of instability and violence in the Middle East is going to have knock-on effects that will reach Europe. Not in the particular case of Gaza refugees, because people can't get in or can't get out. But I think in terms of the way that the mood becomes superheated, the way that anti-Western feeling increases, I think those things are all really serious, and we need to take them very, very seriously. No question about it. Right, okay, we've got another one about Iran and the Saudis, which has come up. I quite like that, this one, hang on. From Alexander Frost. Given its more democratic structure and more open society, does it make more sense to pursue rapprochement with Iran than remain allied to the Saudis? Well, my feeling is it's not a zero-sum game. I think we can do both. At least we could have done both while that nuclear agreement, the so-called JCPOA, was still there. And it is officially still there, but actually it's not really going to last, I think, without the Americans being in it, and actually with the Americans trying to smash it, which is what they're doing at the moment by imposing sanctions on Iran. I think that there are people, not least the president and the foreign minister and the people around them in Iran, who would very much like, they're never going to be friends of the West, but they wanted a rapprochement with them, some kind of modus vivendi. But they're losing out now to the hardliners, who will be saying because the president in Iran, this is another important thing to know actually, the Iranian president is not the top dog in the country. The top person is the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. The president has a lot of responsibilities, but he is not the top guy. But he has been pushing for this opening to the West, and he was only able to try to do it because the supreme leader agreed it was permissible. But now, I guarantee to you, the Supreme Leader will have people around him, serious hardliners, saying, I told you, you can't trust the West. We make a deal with them. First thing they do, they try and get out of it. You know, we need to start enriching uranium again. We need to get our nuclear industry back up. This stuff, they're trying to get us. You know, we are surrounded by nuclear powers. The Israelis have got nuclear weapons. The Americans have got nuclear weapons. The other way, you know, going east, the Pakistanis, the Indians have got nuclear weapons. Maybe we need to get nuclear weapons as well. And they were only potentially a couple of months away from getting one when this agreement was signed. It won't take them, if they wanted to, and they've always denied they want nuclear weapons, but I think they've always wanted the option. It wouldn't take them all that long to get the whole thing going again. Within a year, they could do it. Of course, there may be a war before that, because if they did try and make a nuclear weapon, they'd probably get bombed by the Americans and by the Israelis. And if that happened, there would be a great deal of instability in the Middle East and a lot of trouble. It seems Iran is a key aggressor in the Middle East. Why is this? Well, that's the American view and the Israeli view. The Iranian view is very much that they are a large power with a history, you know, 80 million people and a history going back 5,000 years, and that they have rights and responsibilities as a regional power, and they should be allowed to have allies, and they should be allowed to have interests, and treating them as a sort of criminal nation is not a good thing to do. I don't think that they are an active revolutionary force. I don't think that they actually want to go and overthrow other governments. I think they just want to keep their Islamic system going at home, and they, you know, the rhetoric is very, very strong coming from them, you know, death to America, death to Israel, death to Britain, and all of that. But at the same time, if you actually go to Iran, it's difficult for us at the BBC because it's very hard to get visas, but I've been a few times. If you go to Iran, you'll see that actually most people there just want to do business. You know, the government is way more religious than the people. People want to, if you go to Tehran it's not full of people in black beating their breasts and saying death to America. It happens once a week at the campus of Tehran University when they have Friday prayers. And then there's about a sort of half-hour period where, you know, the usual suspects go out and parade up and down in the street and say death to Israel. Or maybe they don't even go out into the street sometimes. They just do it in a sort of big, large arena. In fact, if you go there, to me, it feels more relaxed than a lot of Arab capitals. Relations between the genders there, I would say, are more relaxed than they are in every Arab capital I can think of, apart from Beirut. And if you count East Jerusalem as a capital, Arab capital, it isn't technically, but you know, the Palestinians regarded as such. That's fairly relaxed between men and women as well. But Tehran is way more relaxed, I think, compared to Cairo, compared to the Gulf, compared to Saudi Arabia. Right, let's look at some more of this. Let's talk a bit. I've mentioned some of the key characters in the region at the moment. Benjamin Netanyahu, Israeli Prime Minister, actually under a lot of pressure from a big fraud investigation. He may end up in jail, perhaps, but he's trying to brazen it out. His predecessor as Israeli Prime Minister ended up in jail, charged with fraud. So, you know, it's a corrupt country, and there's a lot of corruption in Israel, and the police believe is part of it. He denies there's anything like that. Other key people, and this goes again to this split I'm talking about, friends of Iran, friends of America, is the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. He's a man of about 32, 33. When he was Minister of Defense, he was, before he became the Crown Prince, the heir to the throne, he was the guy who was behind the war in Yemen and continues to be pushing it, and is no doubt pushing this Hudaydah operation at the moment. He's an interesting guy because he's trying to, if you haven't heard his name already, you will hear his name more. He's the guy who decided that women should be allowed to drive cars in Saudi Arabia, that they would be allowed to open a few cinemas, because for years they've had no public entertainment whatsoever in Saudi Arabia. So MBS, as he's known, has decided all of that, and he says he wants to modernize Saudi Arabia, to change the economy so it's not dependent on oil. And, you know, he's a young man, and his dad is old and not very well and will probably die fairly soon. So Mohammed bin Salman has made a lot of enemies. He's roasted quite a few of his own family, locked them up, accused them of corruption, made them pay back, in some cases, billions of dollars, which he says they've embezzled. So he's taken away their powers. So there are plenty of people who say that someone sooner or later will try to assassinate him. Hasn't happened yet. But so provided he lasts the course, he will be there maybe for 50 years. So his view of the region is a very, very important one. And he's very much of the point of view that Iran is the sole aggressor and the real problem. And, you know, he has a very shiny air force and a very expensive military, and it may well be that he might decide he wants to use it. So that's something to watch. Another very important person in the region is Putin, President Putin of Russia. Russia got involved at the end of 2015 in the Syrian war. President Obama was still in power, and he said, they'll regret it, it's a quagmire. It hasn't been a quagmire for Russia. Russia has been very specific about what it wanted. Essentially, to beat the Islamist extremists of Islamic State, of ISIS, and to support the man they believe should be in power, who's President Assad. And they did it. It was a pretty simple mission. The West's problem was we couldn't really decide what we wanted. We didn't want ISIS, but we didn't want Assad. So we tried to build up some, another political force among Syrian exiles, and it never worked out. We just gave them money, and they spent it on nicer and nicer suits and hotels, and they disagreed with each other a lot, and that was it. So our policy failed, his succeeded. And his idea was to try to show that Russia, once again, was a great power. And I think he succeeded in doing it, because he is now one of the main arbiters of what happens in Syria, if not the main arbiter, actually. So Putin is a player, thanks to that intervention. And we in the West are not players, because we don't, as is it an American expression, we don't have enough skin in the game. In a country like that, and in a war like that, you can only be influential if you're prepared to get involved and to use force if necessary. We haven't been, basically, in the West. That's why, essentially, our leaders just do a lot of hand-wringing. Oh, my God, this is awful. This is terrible. Look at the way people are suffering. Let's give them some little bit of aid. Maybe we'll let some of them into our country. Not very many when it comes to Britain. The Germans, of course, let a lot of people in, and the Swedes. But the Russians had a very clear intention, and they did it. They delivered on it. There's a question here, what's the role of China? Actually, it's not, they do a little bit of business there. I remember being in a particularly difficult time in Damascus, when there were really no foreigners there apart from a few journalists, and the place was being bombed and shelled and God knows what else. And I noticed in the hotel restaurant, the only guys there who weren't journalists, and there weren't even many journalists, were some Chinese businessmen who were having meetings. I don't speak Chinese, but they were speaking in English to some Syrian guys. And I thought, my God, these guys have come in, and they're trying to do business deals at a time when most people wouldn't go anywhere near the country. So that's, at the moment, what happens is that the Chinese tend to support the Russians in the Security Council. So there's 3 Western permanent members, Britain, France, America, and the other 2, and the Russians and the Chinese, and that's the split in the Security Council. So they don't do a great deal, but I think they'll be doing more and more. Will we ever go, my God, this is the big one, Nick. Will we ever get peace in the Middle East? What will it take? I have to get a drink of water before I try and answer that one. Wait a minute. Well, no. See, I don't think we're going to get peace for it. What's going on now, and this is another important thing. Okay, here's another thing. I've talked about that Iran-America split. There are other things that it's important to know about. And in the Middle East, something that's really important to know about is history. And I'm not proposing to give you a history lesson, but I can tell you that I have never been to a place where history is as alive as it is in the Middle East. When I lived in Jerusalem for 5 or 6 years in the 90s, and in 1997, I think it was, 1997, it was the 50th anniversary of the birth of Israel. And we were doing some reports on it. And I interviewed these Palestinians, old guys in their 60s probably, and I said to them, so what do you think then? What do you think? They've been here 50 years, you've lost the game, haven't you? And they said, oh, no. Look, the Crusaders were here for 100 years, and then we got rid of them. That means we've got 50 years to go. We've got another 50 years before they even get to where the Crusaders were. And I also had, about the same time I was interviewing at a Jewish settlement in the occupied West Bank, illegal under international law. And there was a guy there who'd immigrated into Israel from Argentina. He was an Argentine Jew. And we were walking up and down there, and he was looking down. It's quite a radical settlement. He was looking down at the Palestinians who were working in the fields, and the settlement was on a hilltop. And I said to him, so, typical question you ask settlers and immigrants, say, well, you've just arrived pretty much from Buenos Aires. These guys have been down there for, dozens of generations. He said, oh, no, you've got it completely wrong. I said, I beg your pardon? He said, if the Romans hadn't thrown me out, and he said me, if the Romans hadn't thrown me out from this place 2,000 years ago, I'd still be here. And I would have been here before them. So the Romans threw me out, and those people maybe came. Now, they can live with us if they like, but they have to recognize it's Jewish land. So we've got the Palestinians looking back to the Crusaders, a mere 1,000 years ago. We've got the Jewish guy looking back 2,000 years to the Romans. And there are people there who'll go back further, easily, in one conversation. Suddenly, it's cycling back through history. We go, plenty of people will bring up King David 4,000 years ago in Jerusalem, in a serious conversation about who's right and who's wrong. That's why I doubt that there will be peace in our time in the Middle East, because there are these wounds and differences which go back not just generations, they go back in different forms over thousands of years. So I think to think that a few guys in suits can go into a room and do a deal on some of these big, big issues like the future of Jerusalem, I think is hoping for a bit too much. Jerusalem as a city is probably the most blood-soaked. If you go there, you see these things that pilgrims have, Christian pilgrims saying, pray for Jerusalem, the city of peace, because that's literally, in Hebrew, that's literally what it means, what it comes from, where it comes from, city of peace. In fact, Jerusalem, possession of Jerusalem has changed hands violently 37 times. Most recently in 1967, when Israel captured the old city from the Jordanians. So to think that we can just do a deal now, I'm not saying it's impossible, but you've got to have a great deal of will on either side to make it happen. And they had a go in the 90s, it didn't work. And there's another thing too, the conflict is changing between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's changing because it's becoming more religious. It used to be a much more of a secular thing between two peoples who wanted the same piece of land. But now there are people on both sides who think, well, wait a minute, this was given to us by God. And once you believe that this was given to you by God, it's very hard to say, well, if you're a believer, to say, well, okay, God gave it to us, but what the hell, we'll do a deal with it anyway. No, if you're religious, you'll think, no, God gave it to us. That's it. And that's what quite a lot of Muslims feel, and it's quite a lot of religious Jews feel as well. The 1967 war, in which Israel captured the West Bank, captured Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, captured Gaza. It galvanized the movement of religious Jews, religious Zionists as they're known, because they felt that was land given to them by God, which was taken away from them and restored to them by God in 1967 in a miracle. There are lots of people there who believe there was a miracle. And if you really believe that there was a miracle, you're not going to go into a conference room and say, well, yeah, we got the land in a miracle, but we're not going to give it back. We'll give some of it back. No, they won't. So no, I don't think there's going to be very easy peace at all, to be honest. Let's have a look. How should we respond to the ongoing strain on our relationship with the United States? Should we worry? Yes, I think we should, on a number of grounds. First of all, If you look at what happened in the G7 meeting in Canada the other day, where they were really divided, not least because of the American plans to bring in tariffs on steel and aluminium, and they finally came up with a sort of joint statement, and then the Prime Minister of Canada had the temerity to say, well, we're very glad we got a joint statement, but you need to know that you can't push the Canadians around. Trump spat out his dummy, tweeted from Air Force One, where he was on the way to Singapore for his meeting with the North Korean, tweeted that America was pulling out of that statement, was very rude about Canada and the Canadian Prime Minister, one of his close allies. He hasn't even, when he was talking about, he talked about the French and the Germans as well, didn't even mention Britain. Because I think that so much bandwidth is taken up in Britain now by Brexit that I think people are sort of ignoring us. I think we're left in the corner because we have this internal thing that we're wrangling with the Europeans about. So why does it matter because of the strains with the US relationship? Well, because you can't rely on it. The idea that because we have a certain shared history and we speak the same language, the idea that somehow the Americans are going to help us and bail us out and there's going to be lots of trade deals, a big trade deal easily done, I don't think so. I think that's a real worry for those people, for the government, because, if Trump won't even allow the Prime Minister of Canada to say you can't push Canada around, if we had the temerity to go into a negotiation and say, well, actually, we'd rather not have chicken that's washed with chlorine or beef that's pumped full of antibiotics and all the other things they might want to take as a price for a trade deal, I think they'll say, all right, then get lost. There was, on Twitter yesterday, there's a guy called Jeff Goldberg, who's a leading writer and magazine editor. See, look at that risk assessment. I'm tripping over the bloody monitor. He's a leading magazine editor in the United States. And he was trying to see, he said he's been doing some research and trying to work out if there's such a thing as a Trump doctrine. All American presidents in foreign policy like to have a doctrine. In other words, some underlying feature of their policy, which will identify it, and it's like a sort of framework of reference. So he said he's been asking, whenever he meets top people in the Trump administration, he says, have we worked out yet what the Trump doctrine is? And finally, he said he felt he was making progress when he spoke to a very senior person in the White House and said, have you sorted out the Trump doctrine? And he said, yes, we've sorted out the Trump doctrine. He said, oh, what is it? He said, well, the Trump doctrine is, hey, we're America, bitch. And so that's about where we are with Trump. And I think that, in other words, you've got to do as you're told. You've got to be his bitch. I think that's part of it. What's the biggest threat to the UK from the Middle East? It's multifaceted. I think in recent years, it's been the fact that there have been people in this country who've become fellow travelers for ISIS, British-born people who have decided, who feel so alienated from our society that they're prepared to take part in acts of terrorism or even go over to Syria or Iraq or wherever to fight. I mean, that has been one of the ways in which the shockwaves of what's going on in the region have hit us. I think the migrant crisis of a couple of years ago did as well, because it increases pressure on people trying to come in via Calais. I think we need to know now, and I think people do realize increasingly, that when you're sitting, if you're lucky enough this summer to be sitting on a Mediterranean beach, enjoying your, whatever it is you do on a Mediterranean beach, have your glass of rosé, or you go and do a lot of volleyball or something, I think people are realizing that actually just on the other side of the horizon is the Middle East. It's not very far away. and we have to understand it. We cannot avoid it. Would you go on a holiday to Tunisia or Egypt? Ah, that's a good one. Would I go on holiday? Well, I mean, I took my kids, who are teenagers, in half-term, end of last year, we went to Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, the West Bank, Bethlehem. We didn't go to Gaza. And in the past, I took my daughter the year before the war started, when she was 9. I took her to Syria. So my ideas about, I'm fairly open to going to places. Egypt, if you want to go to one of those nice places in Sharm and around there, in the Red Sea, which are hotel compounds, great big things like the Movenpick or the Four Seasons, it's fine. But don't go out in the desert on your own, because there are jihadists further north in Sinai, but they can find their way down. Don't rent a Jeep and go out on your own in the desert, but by all means stay in the hotel behind nice security and enjoy it. It's also okay, I'd say, to go to in Egypt, to go to the very well-known places, like the pyramids, or Luxor, or something like that. That's probably okay as well, because there's a lot of security there. But do not go, if you go, don't go off the beaten track. We go off the beaten track, and we get into quite serious trouble occasionally, because there's a lot of anti-Western feeling. And, okay, you won't have a TV camera, so you might have a little video, perhaps. And you can get people, if you get one person, you're in a poor part of Cairo, and someone says, look, they're spreading bad news about Egypt, and they've heard constantly in the official media that foreigners are spreading bad news about Egypt. And you can suddenly have about 60 people around you tugging at your clothes and trying to smash your cameras. So that's no fun. But in the main places, it's okay. In Cairo, I would stay at the Marriott Hotel. It's rather nice. It's in an old palace. And there's another one too, the Sofitel. It's right on the Nile. It's got a great pool. Sorry, I'm a bit of an expert at hotels in the Middle East. I can write a book about them probably. Tunisia is fine. I go to Tunisia. We probably get a deal because people are still a bit worried about it. They had that very tragic incident, but generally speaking, Tunisia, they're trying to make political progress. The government there is not anti-Western, unlike the one in Egypt. And so yeah, Tunisia would probably be okay. But again, don't go off the beaten track, because we do that, and it's not a holiday if you have to do things like that. It's more of a job. Would more diverse international leadership lead to long-term peace, says Anonymous. I don't buy the idea that if there were more female leaders, which I take it is what you're referring to, things will be a lot more peaceful. I don't think that, maybe it's because to become a leader, women have to adopt all the features of the patriarchy. Hear a lot about that at the BBC, the patriarchy. Apparently I'm part of it. I didn't realize that until recently. So no, I don't think it would be particularly helpful, actually, because I think if you want to run a country has interests. I think it's fairly gender blind. I don't buy the idea that it would be somehow uniquely different if women were in charge, because when women have been in charge, they tend to outdo the men in terms of Mrs. Thatcher, Golda Meir in Israel, Mrs. Gandhi in India. Who's the toughest politician in Europe at the moment? Angela Merkel, probably. They don't go to war in Germany because of their history, but, she's very tough when it comes to standing up for Germany. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. DT and Putin relationship, real or fake? Good question. There's a big FBI investigation going on into Trump's adventures in Russia. So I don't know if it's real or fake. I think that it's interesting how Trump seems to have more time for authoritarian leaders than he does for democratic leaders. Putin, Kim Jong-un, he's made that agreement, supposedly, with the North Koreans. There's not much substance to it. If it's the start of a process, it will be potentially something pretty amazing. But for the time being, let's not get too carried away with it. Do you think Hillary will ever make it? Not to be president, no. She's had a chance, and she lost. I think she lost because she didn't appeal to a wider tranche of people in the way that Trump managed to get people to vote who didn't normally vote. And Hillary appealed very strongly to some groups, and others completely hated her. So that's why she didn't win. And the thing about the US at the moment, I think, is that at the moment I don't see who is going to rival Trump for a second term. I think we've got Trump for a while. He might get a second term, so another 4 years. And so goodness knows where we'll be after that. I think we are, what's the gossip about the Salisbury incident? Oh, the Salisbury, the Russian poisoning. I haven't really covered that, I'm afraid, so I don't actually know. And your thoughts on the Middle East-Africa relations, again, that's not one of my things particularly. Who was the most inspirational person you've ever interviewed? This is a good way to end because we've got almost no time left. Well, I was going to talk to you about Gaddafi, very strange man to interview, dressed in this brown ochre robe, aviator sunglasses, sort of turban, a man who designed his own uniforms, designed his own medals, and then awarded them to himself. I had the pleasure of interviewing him a few months before a group of angry Libyans grabbed him and put him to death in a particularly gory manner. I've also interviewed President Assad, unbelievably polite, incredibly polite, in an old-fashioned way. You know, he'd practically break his neck to leap out of his seat to make sure that, you know, you go out of the building first, the room first, and very, very polite and quite nice if you didn't think when you saw him that his army's probably killed about 400,000 Syrian citizens, and half the population of the pre-war population of the country, about 12 million people, they're either internal refugees or refugees abroad. So neither of them were inspiring. They were kind of interesting, but they weren't inspiring. Assad said to me, there's no such thing as barrel bombs. You know, people often film these barrel bombs, which is a steel barrel full of explosive being dropped from the back of a helicopter. It's been filmed. He said, there's never been such a thing as a barrel bomb. And there was some talk that because people I interview tend to then lose power and get killed, like Gaddafi, that he was reluctant to be interviewed by me, and it took a couple of years to sort the whole thing out. The older people in this room may remember an American singer called Donny Osmond. And when I was presenting Breakfast on BBC One, I interviewed Donny Osmond. And I've got to say, I used to hate his music when I was a teenager, but I've got to say, he was one of the nicest people I've ever interviewed, because his teeth were unbelievable, his hair was just, whoa, his skin, and he was older than me. So I like Donny Osmond. The worst person I ever interviewed when I was doing Breakfast was a guy called Christopher Plummer, who played the dad in The Sound of Music, Commander Von Trapp. And I thought, my daughter was very into The Sound of Music, age of about 4, so I thought, I've got this one nailed. I don't have to do any revision for this interview. We'll just talk about The Sound of Music. And just as he was about to start talking to me, I had a message in my ear saying, Mr. Plummer's here. He'll talk about anything except The Sound of Music. So that interview went very, very badly. And I just became obsessed by the fact that he was giving me increasingly monosyllabic answers as I was struggling. I cut it short. We were meant to do 12 minutes with him. I did about 2 minutes in the end. And I'll just end by, since we're on the subject of Breakfast, I've spent most of my career as a foreign correspondent, traveling in war zones, difficult places. But for a few years, I was the morning TV anchor, presenting breakfast on BBC One with the lovely Sophie Rayworth, who's a very good friend of mine. We still talk every day. And, but when I started, there was a bit of a transitional period from being a man out and about around the world to being in the studio in Television Centre. And so I thought, gosh, how do I make this connection with the camera? I'm quite good at making the connection with the camera when I'm out and about, but in the studio, it's much more difficult. So I spoke to someone else who'd presented the program, a woman who'd presented the program a couple of generations before Sophie. And I said, look, you had a really good connection with the camera. What do you do? What is the secret? And she said, well, do you really want to know? I said, yeah, I'd like to know. She said, well, what I do is, first thing, I look in the camera and I think to myself, I really want to shag you and you really want to shag me. So I thought, oh yeah, okay, right. I said, really, is that what you do? Well, even at sort of 25 to 7 in the morning? Yeah, even at 25 to 7 in the morning. So, okay, right, I'm going to try it. So the next day, I was in the studio, and I thought, no, is this the moment? Shall I do shall I do my sort of Zoolander thing? You know, try and look smouldering and sexy in the camera like that. So I thought, right, I'm going to try it now. And Sophie was talking, and we were in a two-shot, so I knew I had a chance to look in the camera and not say anything, but try and look sexy. And so the director in my ear said, Jeremy, he said, are you okay? Are you in pain, in some sense? So I think we should leave it there. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.